Welcome everyone. It gives me great pleasure to offer you some opening remarks and say a few words by way of introduction. But first and foremost, welcome to the Graduate Institute and welcome to the Valueworks research team. And I wanted to say a couple of words by way of introduction, talking mostly about Zambia as the home of the most famous copper belt and exemplary on many accounts. And I want to start by offering some historical notes on why I take Zambia to be a particularly relevant and exemplary case on different accounts. Because it was precisely on the copper belt, and what was then Northern Rhodesia, that by the 1930s, the colonial dual mandate of indirect rule started to collapse. And it started to collapse not because there were no native political structures upon which colonial administration could rely on, but because these had become highly distorted through precisely the massive demand for native labor in the mining industry, as well as the accumulation of seemingly detribalized, quote-unquote, migrants in these urban spaces. Godfrey Wilson, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, the first director of the Rhodes Livingstone Institute of Social Studies, which was founded with a view towards emerging social problems, put his finger squarely on a set of issues that resonate, I think, quite well with the contemporary moment. In his famous essay on the economics of detribalization in Northern Rhodesia, published in 1941, Wilson wrote of Africans on the copper belt not as tribesmen, but, as I quote, as members of a huge worldwide community, their lives bound up at every point with events of its history. Their standard of living, he continued, now depends on economic conditions in Europe, Asia, and America, to which continents their labor has become essential. These words were written in 1941. With the end of the copper mining boom in the 1970s and 1980s, Zambia entered a process of de-urbanization and de-industrialization that gave copper mine workers a sense of being left outside or discarded from the promises of modernity. So from the modern, urban, and somewhat prosperous class, these workers were not just excluded, but actively expelled from this new world society brought by independence, in what anthropologist James Ferguson, in his book Expectations of Modernity, would call the social experience of decline. Today, Zambia is also at the forefront of some of perhaps the most disquieting developments surrounding predatory foreign debt. Unable to repay its loans, it has been recently revealed that China is poised to take over Zambia's national power utility company. This latest issue joins a broader tendency in which large trading companies such as Glencore increasingly act as sovereign lenders, owning national debt with higher risk premiums and shorter time frames for prepayment. So what is there to do beyond restating the somewhat worn out terms of the resource curse, now termed debt curse? I think that research, such as the one put forth by the team of Valueworks, exploring the effects of financialization along the copper value chain, offers an apt response in at least three different domains. The first, along with global value transfers, one should consider the kinds of data and information asymmetries, particularly surrounding non-disclosure agreements, secret contracts, etc. Secondly, I think it's important to develop this kind of inquiry beyond sort of the national economy and towards these transnational flows and institutions to compensate for what geographer and political ecologist Michael Watts called the almost total invisibility of both transnational oil companies and the forms of capitalism that oil and enclave extraction engenders. Thirdly, I think this kind of research allows us to broaden the analysis to include also the linkages between production, consumption, and governance, as well as the political and social effects of regimes of transparency or ethicality. I think these three strategies combined provide a much solid, robust explanatory reach to what remains to date a neo-defined and somewhat ahistorical relation between the commodity proper, copper, a condition of scarcity and abundance, and the spatialization of value creation and circulation. So on that note, again, I want to welcome you all to the Graduate Institute, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
So good evening everybody, my name is Paul Ladd, I'm the Director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development. Let me add my thanks to Filipe, let me add my welcome, but also my thanks to the research team and to the Graduate Institute for hosting us this evening. For those of you that don't know us, UNRISD is an autonomous research institute based in the United Nations that undertakes interdisciplinary research and policy analysis on the social policy dimensions of contemporary development issues. Now, this roundtable this evening precedes a day-long research symposium tomorrow in the Palais des Nations, and I think we'll have, of course, some of the presenters tomorrow as well. And I think the registration is still open for that if people also want to join us for a part of it. Now, I don't want to say too much, but I thought I might really perhaps approach it from the other way around. Filipe covered Zambia. I'm going to start at the global level, just with a couple of framing remarks. Now, there have been concerns about unequal power relations along global value chains since, well, the existence of global value chains, before technology, before financialization. But the important differences now exist precisely in sort of the recent history of 4 decades of relatively unbridled capitalism, what some people would call the era of modern neoliberalism, which has seen the need for economic efficiency take precedent at the cost of some human or societal protections, perhaps seemingly inefficiencies within that system. Now, this has been underpinned and sometimes driven by an increasing financialization of all markets and all sectors, with complicated financial instruments that abstract from the real economy and people's relationship to it. And a world now where technology is advancing into decision-making, including in commodity trading, in roles that were previously assumed by humans, at the risk of becoming inhuman. Now, within many countries, this has led to huge concentrations of wealth for some people, and yet for many others, huge insecurity because they bear more of the risks in the marketplace associated with the provision of their labour or the production of their goods. And this has led to a tipping point of globalisation discontent in some richer countries, the rise of populist nationalism, the withdrawal behind the walls of sovereignty and the weakening of multilateral cooperation. Now, all this at a time when we face the mountainous imperative of sustainable development, sustainability socially, economically and environmentally, the need to reduce poverty and exclusion, nurture economic activities that give dignity to all people, that can pay for and deliver important services, and that respect and live within the natural boundaries provided by the planet. What UNRISD termed in our last major report an eco-social transformation. And that's why I wanted to mention the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. These provide an important framing, especially for a research institute embedded in the UN. Our job is to show, through research and policy advice, how governments on their own and working together can achieve them for a fairer global economy and for fairer global commodity chains. Now, with that, let me just stop there and hand over to the experts on this precise topic. Thank you all for coming. We welcome you tomorrow should you wish to come. And I also thank my team and UNRISD who put a lot of work into the project and our contribution to it. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Isolda Gazzi. I am the moderator of this debate tonight. First of all, I would like to thank you for braving the call to be with us. I am sure you will not regret it, because if I have the pleasure of welcoming you in this beautiful building, it is to talk about a very timely issue that affects us all closely as Swiss citizens, or at least as residents of this country, and more particularly of Geneva. Switzerland is the hub of commodity trading worldwide. It hosts as many as 544 multinational trading companies. Trading represents 3.8% of the national GDP of Switzerland, or 25 billion Swiss francs. The main traders are located in the Lake Geneva region, and the canton of Geneva alone derives 20% of its GDP from trading activities. However, Developing countries rich in raw materials do not benefit much from them starting with African countries. This is the starting point of a research project financed by the Swiss Network for International Studies. Yet, if people in resource-producing countries benefited more from commodity rents, at least 540 million people could escape poverty. It has been calculated. But what should be done? How can this particularly opaque sector be regulated? 10 days ago, the Federal Council, which is the federal government of Switzerland, has published a report that refuses to impose binding regulation on traders. It does recognize the challenges that commodity trading poses to human rights and the environment, but fearing to give an advantage to competing hubs like Singapore and London, it leaves it to voluntary measures, like, for example, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So mandatory transparency requirements will apply only to extractive industries and not to trading one. In the case of Switzerland, concretely, that means only 4 out of 544 multinationals. So, how to fight against corruption and money laundering? What role can Switzerland play? Taking the example of Zambia's copper value chain. This is the subject of tonight's debate. We will discuss it with researchers, NGOs, a trader, and a local politician. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the distinguished panelists who will present the main outcomes of the research project. There has been a last-minute change from what was originally announced, since Rita Kesselring is unfortunately ill. But Gregor Dobler, who is also part of the research team, has been able to replace her, and we are very happy to welcome him. So now I would like to give the floor to Gregor Dobler, precisely, who is professor of social anthropology at the University of Freiburg in Germany.
Thank you very much, Isolda. Thanks to everybody of you for being here. The presentation should come up here. Yes, it is. So you see that the name on the presentation is not mine and not Rita Kesselring. She's very sorry for not being here, and I don't say that lightly. She is sorry, and she's probably watching this on live stream now. She just came down with the flu, and she's the person who really brought us all here, who put the project together, who contacted each of us, and really got this going. We had 2 years of research, which, if you know anything about research, you know that it's not much. But it was a fascinating opportunity to get to know many topics and to get deeper insights into many topics. And we're very grateful to SNIS, the Swiss Network for International Studies, for funding this. So what is this about? Let me just give you a few hints about the projects, about our perspectives, and about today's roundtable as an introduction. And those of you who are more interested in hearing more are warmly invited to the symposium tomorrow. The background of a project. Where some intriguing facts that are more and more being discussed in the Swiss public as well. Transit trade is taking up a bigger share in Swiss GDP than tourism or banking, if you look at turnover. 60% of globally traded metals and also 60% of copper traded worldwide are traded in Switzerland. In transit trade, mostly without ever touching Swiss soil, obviously. This is part of a global division of labor in an age of increasing financialization, in which not only, as it has been for the last 100 years, some countries are tied to resource extraction, but other countries become more and more specialized in services. And this is kind of refiguring value chains for quite a number of commodities. Our guiding question in the project was where, how, and by whom value was captured along the copper value chain between Zambian mines and Chinese producers, with Switzerland sitting in between as a link between the markets. So we take Zambia as an example to understand Switzerland's economic role. And we take Switzerland as an example to understand Zambia's economic role in the global economy. To a certain degree, it's a small project. We only take one country and one commodity. But on the other hand, it's a very big project because you cannot understand the structures without actually trying to understand the financialized global economy today. The project, as well as small and big, it's rather small in terms of money, but it's big in terms of cooperation partners, people invested in it, people fascinated by the topics, which came together in our project. So we have 22 research partners based in Switzerland, Germany, the UK, China, and Zambia. And we have, from the beginning, been collaborating with civil society organizations, with NGOs and CSOs in both Switzerland and Zambia. So it was quite a challenge to squeeze all the logos onto one page, even if some of the CSOs don't even have logos. I'm not going through all of them. It's a mix between universities, research organizations, NGOs with a strict organization and officers and people paid to do the work, and civil society organizations based on volunteer work, and an international organization, UNRISD, of course. So, I'm not going to give you the results. I'm just once more giving you some framework for tonight. Why Zambia and Switzerland? If you look at the data, that's just between 1996 and 2015, how much copper is being exported from Zambia to different countries. And that orange line is Switzerland. It took us a while to really understand the statistics, not easy to say what's behind it. Actually, the amount of copper traded by Swiss companies is much higher than the amount here that's linked to the statistical artifacts in the export statistics of Zambia. But even here you see that 50% of Zambian copper is officially exported to Zambia, which means it's being traded, to Switzerland, which means it's being traded by Swiss companies. And copper makes up 70% of Zambian export income. So Zambia is tightly linked to Switzerland. And trade is not only somebody who sits in an office at a computer and buying and selling contracts. Trade is much more than just to buy and to sell. It covers a large part of the value chain. You have transport of copper, you have warehousing, you have ocean shipping, you have fuel supply for all these activities. You have certification and surveillance of shipments. You have customs declaration and so on. All that is part of activities some traders at least are doing. Let's take the example of Gregor, since the head of global corporate responsibility is here and we'll discuss on the roundtable. So Gregor has a stake in fuel shipping and fuel selling in Southern Africa through its subsidiary Puma Energies. It owns sea terminals, or leases sea terminals, owns warehouses and truck stops in DRC, in Zambia, and Tanzania, through Impala terminals, another subsidiary. It operates, or is starting to operate, a train route from the copper belt, from the copper region, Kolwezi in the DRC, to Lobito in Angola, through another subsidiary, DTS. And it acts, we've heard of this a minute ago, as a lender also. Not in Zambia as far as we know, but for example in Congo-Brazzaville, which came up earlier this year. So this is quite a range of activities which come together in what is called a trading company. And from these activities, quite a lot of debates emerge. So in the Swiss public, it's being discussed whether Swiss trade is an asset to the Swiss economy that sets us apart in the global economy, or as part of a global problem. And you all know these discussions in the public. It's currently discussed on a federal level. You had the commodities report and the guidance that came out 2 weeks ago. You have current discussions in the small chamber, the Ständerat, on transparency and whether to include traders into transparency rules. So it has not been decided yet. It's currently under discussion. And you have discussions in the public, for example, the Responsible Business Initiative, of which we will know whether it's going to be voted on by the public probably in spring. A second debate is how to regulate. So if we acknowledge that it needs regulation, should this be self-regulation, multi-stakeholder initiatives, or should it be state regulation by laws? The point of debate that's more on the academic level, not so much in the public political sphere, is how financialization of the economy and servicification of the economy actually intersect. And the final point is what we as researchers see as a need for more transparency in order to decide these other debates. We need to know much more on this. And even after 2 years of collaborative research of many people, it has been quite difficult to actually get a sense of the corporate world in Switzerland and to get access to companies. So these are the 2 reports that came out on the federal level recently. The council report and the guidance, which tells companies who actually are keen on implementing human rights and regulations in their human rights standards in their companies, how to do it. And there's another report that came out a few weeks ago, which you see also at the table in front, Africa Visitor, which sums up a few first results of our research in a very accessible manner. It has been translated by Sneeze into English as well, so you'll find both versions, the German one and the English one, at the table outside. And with that, I thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the roundtable and the discussions.
Right, good evening. My name is Marja Hinfelaar. I work for the South African Institute for Policy and Research. And I've been in Zambia for 21 years, so I call it home. And very much involved. I'm a historian by profession, but also engaged in political analysis. On the Zambian side, we've been coordinating a different group of people. We had a trade economist on our side. We had people in the copper belt who were looking at what's the effect of privatization on deregulation and what the environmental impact of that. And then we also have been looking a little bit further, like what does industrialization mean for other sectors in society, like land to be seen as a commodity rather than traditional. Sorry. So I just want to give a brief background to the Zambian copper sector so you have a bit of context for the discussion. Historical context, like was mentioned earlier, Zambia started as an extractive state. It was the British South African Company in 1896, which ruled Zambia on behalf of the British. And it was really for the copper that it was there. So the copper belt, you can see its location. We've got the old copper belt, which has been in existence for like 100 years, but you also have the new copper belt, which is to the northwest, which is more based within the rural areas. The old copper belt is more an urban area, so it plays out very differently. It was privately run, always traded in the London Stock Exchange, and then the industry was nationalized after independence. Privatization took place in the 1990s, but was completed in the early 2000s. And as we've seen before, trade shifted to Switzerland. Copper is dominant in Zambia in different ways. In 1964, you can see 98% of the export was copper, which is really, really high. That has gone down. There's been some level of diversification, but you can see the dependency is still pretty high. Copper belt also means, because that's where industrialization took place, it's also where trade unionism was very much alive, and it's also a hotbed for politics and political change. Zambia is among the 10 copper producing countries in 2015. That sounds like really large, but at the same time it only means a few percentage. So our leverage in the whole copper industry is pretty low. There's been some attempts to become like an equivalent for like OPEC, where oil companies start coming together as they would have more leverage as a copper trading countries. That happened in the 1970s, but never came to fruition. So Zambia is really on its own when it comes to trade. The privatization was a very painful experience for Zambia. The loss of income or jobs, the copper belt was deindustrialized, as we heard before. Of course, it also revived part of the mining sector as well. And the reaction was found really soon after, so in the form of resource nationalism. Not that Zambia wanted to nationalize its industry again, but it was more like, how can we protect labor, how can we protect the environment, and how can we get more tax out of it? When they were privatized, the tax agreements were very unfavorable to Zambia. And with the copper prices going up in the 2000s, reaching really heights of like $8,000 per ton, there was a need to increase and change the taxation regime. And that happened with the 2008 Mineral Royalty Act. But you can see from this graph how irregular that's been. So it's very ad hoc. And it's in a way, it's trying government to increase and then also the leverage of industry to moderate those levels. And also depending on the prices at the time. So you can see that there's very little consistency in policies. There was also the idea of sharing revenue with local communities, because all the revenues go to Lusaka, central government, and then gets redistributed. It doesn't go to the people on the ground. The clause was never implemented. So the effects of natural resource nationalism in Zambia, you can see it had some effect. You see an increase of revenue, at the latest 22% of GDP, and it came from a very low percentage. At the same time, from the Gini coefficient at the top, you can see inequality has increased a lot. So it seems also the distribution is very uneven. What are some of these obstacles to really come for these fundamental changes? And of course it will come for in our roundtable. But like I said before, there's a huge leverage of industry. It's very powerful, we're very dependent, so it's very difficult to negotiate that relationship. The lack of transparency, that we don't always know what's going on. It's very difficult to tax if you don't know exactly what trade is going on. It's also domestic, as we shouldn't forget the local story, that we also, because of the political factionalism and the number of political changeovers, we've had difficulties adhering to long-term strategies. And also, of course, an interest of particular elite to protect these industries. So it has really not benefited the large population at all. That's where I want to end up before we go for the roundtable.